Greetings everyone. Welcome to the series on symbolic expressions. For today's lecture, the topic is Colonialism and Nationalism, and we have with us the sign language interpreter Manisha Sharma. Presently, I am going to discuss as to how partition of Bengal resulted in several changes in the political scene during the colonial period. So there was the formation of Muslim League. All India Muslim League was formed at Dhaka in 1906 by a group of Muslim landlords and Nawabs. The League supported the partition of Bengal. Some seats in the council were reserved for the Muslims. The League wanted the representatives for those seats to be elected by Muslim voters. This demand was willingly accepted by the government in 1909 because the government was playing the game of divide and rule. There was a split in the Congress in 1907, which is known as moderate extremist split. The moderates were opposed to the use of any kind of violence. After the split, the Congress came to be dominated by the moderates. However, the two groups reunited in 1915. In 1916, the Congress and the Muslim League signed the historic Lucknow Pact. They decided to work together for representative government in the country. Now, a very important development that was going on internationally was the beginning of World War I, and one must see what was its impact on India. There was rise of mass nationalists. The First World War changed the economic and political situation in India drastically. There was a sharp price rise which increased the problems of the common people. The business groups reaped huge profits because the war increased the demand for all kinds of goods. Reduced imports meant that the new demand was being met by the Indian business houses. The business groups now began to demand more opportunities for development. Many people from the villages were forced to serve in the British Army during the war. Exposure to the alien lands helped Indians in understanding the exploitation being done by the colonial powers in other parts of the world and how they were fighting to win over their rights. It was in this background that the Russian Revolution took place in 1917. So news about peasants and workers' struggle and ideas of socialism also reached the nationalist groups in India. So India's participation in the First World War from 1914 to 1918 definitely brought about several changes. And it was in this background that another very important development took place, and that was advent of Mahatma Gandhi, who was born in 1869, 2nd October, Porbandar, Gujarat. He studied and then moved to South Africa, where he was thrown out of train due to racism, and this greatly inspired him to start a movement in South Africa also for human rights. In 1894, he formed a group called Natal Indian Congress. He started Satyagraha in South Africa, and because of his movements against racial restrictions in South Africa, he became a much respected leader. After his arrival in India, he started a number of local movements from 1915 onwards, because he first wanted to understand the people, their needs, the overall situation in India. So the first few years in India, he spent traveling throughout the country and it was during this period that a number of local movements were started by him in Champaran, Kheda and Ahmedabad. So, for example, in 1917 in Champaran, Bihar, he started the famous Satyagraha movement, and Sabarmati Ashram was also established. Now, due to these local movements, he soon became a force to reckon with, and from 1920 onwards, when he had assumed great popularity, the non-cooperation movement was started, and from 1921 onwards he became one of the main leaders of Indian National Congress. Finally, in 1929 a resolution was passed in Lahore for complete independence, that is Sampurna Swaraj. 1930 came to be observed as Independence Day on 26th January 1930. Then in March 1930, Dandi March or Namak Satyagraha was started, during which he travelled 390 kilometers on foot from Sabarmati Ashram to Dandi in a span of 24 days. Another major movement started by Mahatma Gandhi was the Quit India movement 1942, during which he gave the famous slogan, "Do or die." This was one of the most violent movements, and a number of Congress leaders, including Mahatma Gandhi, were arrested, and there were heavy protests all across the nation. And finally, on 15th August 1947, India got freedom. Now, having discussed the course of the movement, let us now go back to the coming of Mahatma Gandhi on Indian scene and how he started organizing Indians both politically as well as mobilized them socially to deal with several problems, especially the problem of untouchability. So, the most important movement besides the local movements that we have already talked about was the movement against Jallianwala Bagh massacre as well as the Rowlatt Act. The Rowlatt Act had been passed in 1919, according to which the British government could imprison any person without any warrant for 2 years without trial. This act curbed the freedom of expression and also strengthened police powers. So, the Rowlatt Act Satyagraha was planned through nationwide hartal, fasting, civil disobedience movement against some specific laws, and finally the Jallianwala Bagh massacre happened. Dr. Saifuddin Kichlu and Dr. Satyapal were arrested by Britishers under the Rowlatt Act. In order to protest against this, a number of protesters gathered at Jallianwala Bagh on 13th April 1919, which was also the day of Baisakhi. General Dyer opened fire on protesters, and so several Indians lost their lives without their having committed any crime. This clearly violated the basic rights of Indians. Rabindranath Tagore renounced his knighthood in protest of Jallianwala Bagh incident. Another important movement that had started was that of Khilafat movement on the issue of Khilafat that was being planned by Indian Muslims because of the wrongs that had been done to Turkey in the course of the First World War. After the First World War, a very harsh treaty had been imposed on Turkish Khalifa. The leaders of the Khilafat agitation, Muhammad Ali and Shaukat Ali, wanted to associate with the non-cooperation movement. The Muslims wanted the Khilafat to retain control over Muslim sacred places in the earlier Ottoman Empire, which was under Turkey. And Mahatma Gandhi supported the Khilafat movement as this clearly was an opportunity to bridge the divide between Hindus and Muslims. The non-cooperation movement gained momentum through 1921 to 22. Several students left schools and colleges to join the movement. Several eminent professionals also gave up their profession to join this movement. Several bonfires of foreign cloth were burnt, and this resulted in drastic falling of imports between 1920 and 22. A number of initiatives were started by people. British titles were surrendered and legislatures were boycotted. Liquor shops were picketed in coastal Andhra and interior Tamil Nadu. The tribals and the poor peasants in Guntur district staged a number of forest satyagrahas. The Khilafat non-cooperation movement gave enormous support, and in Punjab, the Akali agitation of the Sikhs demanded to remove the corrupt Mahants from Gurudwaras. So therefore, in different parts of country, whether it was Sindh or Bengal or Punjab or Andhra Pradesh, this movement was gradually picking up. In Assam, the tea garden laborers demanded a hike in their wages and they shouted the slogan, Gandhi Maharaj Ki Jai. There were a number of folk songs in Assam in which Mahatma Gandhi was referred to as Gandhi Raja, as one of their saviors. So Mahatma Gandhi, in due course of time, came to be considered as a savior. This not only helped in fighting caste oppression, peasants in Pratapgarh in United Provinces also managed to stop illegal eviction of tenants. There were some very important developments that took place from 1922 to 1929 that further changed the future course of action. Mahatma Gandhi abruptly called off non-cooperation movement in 1922 when people put fire to a police station in Chauri Chaura in which 22 policemen died. And so now he called for constructive works in rural areas. Chittaranjan Das and Motilal Nehru, however, decided that party should fight elections to enter councils and influence government policies. Then there was also formation of RSS and Communist Party of India. This period is also known as an important period because of rising participation of youth like Bhagat Singh, who famously declared that it takes a loud voice to make the deaf hear. So his famous slogan, Inqilab Zindabad. In 1927, a very important development was the Simon Commission by Lord Simon to decide on future political course. However, this had been planned without any Indian representative, and so it was boycotted in India with the famous slogan, Simon Go Back. In 1929, the demand for Purna Swaraj or complete independence was raised under Jawaharlal Nehru, and 26th January 1930 was observed as Independence Day. In the course of Dandi March or Salt Satyagraha that was planned in March 1930, there was a march to break the salt law. Salt law gave a monopoly right to the state on the manufacture and sale of salt, as Why this protest was planned? Because it was sinful to tax an essential commodity like salt. So for 240 miles from Sabarmati Ashram to the coastal town of Dandi, this march was planned. Sarojini Naidu persuaded Mahatma Gandhi to allow women to join this movement. The salt movement attracted several supporters, including tribals, peasants, women, and people from all walks of life. Due to this rising protest, the government, however, was forced to reconsider its decision, and finally in 1935, Government of India Act was passed, which introduced the principle of provincial autonomy. In 1937, government announced elections to the provincial legislature, in which Congress won 7 out of 11 provinces. Finally, in 1939, when the Second World War started, and again now the Britishers approached Congress and asked for their help, Congress declared that it was ready to support British against Germany, but wanted independence of India, which was refused by British. A very important development during this period was the formation of Indian National Army in 1941. The entry of India into the war was strongly opposed by Subhash Chandra Bose, who had been elected President of the Congress in 1938 and 1939. But later on he resigned due to differences in opinion with Mahatma Gandhi. Bose then founded All India Forward Bloc in 1940, a year after the Second World War broke out, and the British had put Bose under house arrest in Calcutta. However, he escaped and made his way through Afghanistan to Germany to seek help from Hitler and Mussolini for raising an army to fight the colonial masters. In 1944, it entered India through Imphal and Kohima, but the campaign was not a success. Now, discussing the future course of action during Quit India movement, Mahatma Gandhi had decided to begin a new phase of movement against the British with his famous slogan, "Do or die." Peasants and youths participated in the movement in large numbers. Symbols of state authority were attacked all over the country. Telephone lines were cut off and people gave up their government jobs, and students withdrew from educational institutions. The British responded, however, with severe repression, and by the end of 1943, over 90,000 people had been arrested, thousands were killed in police firing, but finally the movement succeeded. The next important phase that needs to be discussed is the partition and independence. This began with the demand for separate nation. In the 1940s, the Muslim League moved a resolution to demand independent states for the Muslims in the northwestern and eastern areas of the country. From the late 1930s, the League began to visualize the Muslims as a separate nation from the Hindus. There were widening of differences between League and Congress. Results of the provincial elections of 1937 convinced the League that Muslims were a minority and their rights could only be preserved if they got a separate state. So there was also the problem of widening of differences between League and Congress. League feared that Muslims would have to play second fiddle in any democratic structure in the future. So, talks between Muslims and League failed as League saw itself as the sole spokesperson of Indian Muslims, but Congress had a huge support from Muslims and it considered itself to be representative of all the communities. So, elections to provinces were held again in 1946 and Congress performed well in general constituencies, but League succeeded on Muslim seats. In March 1946, a 3-member cabinet mission was sent to Delhi to examine this demand and suggest suitable framework for independent India. The Congress and the Muslim League could not agree to specific details of the proposals of the cabinet mission. And after its failure, the Muslim League decided on mass agitation for winning its demand of Pakistan. It announced 16th August 1946 as Direct Action Day. Riots broke out in Calcutta on this day and the riots lasted for several days. The violence soon spread to different parts of North India and finally partition became a reality and the two nations, India and Pakistan, were born. A number of leaders played a very important role. For example, Khan Abdur Ghaffar Khan, Maulana Azad, C. Rajgopalachari, Sardar Patel, Jawaharlal Nehru. However, there were a number of other leaders and common people also who have not really been mentioned, and their contribution also must be taken care of and must be accounted for. Therefore, the role that was played by the peasants, the working class, the tribals, the subaltern groups, women, all that must be considered as very important and instrumental in making us live in a free India. Thank you.